Good evening, viewers, and welcome to the second virtual session of Naturenomics Dialogues 2.0 on Rewilding the Future, exploring the role that our rich forests can play in our well-being and resilience beyond the limitations of the GDP. In our previous session, Rewilding the Ecological Budget, we explored how we can change the way we invest in nature through better CSR, natural capital accounting, and ecosystems service markets. Today's session will explore the question of rewilding well-being and equity on moving beyond the GDP model of infinite growth to radically redefine human well-being and integrate the role nature plays in economic, social, and cultural well-being. Before I begin, I would like to thank all our attendees for showing interest and joining in virtually to our session. I will request our viewers to engage actively with today's panel by putting forward their questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom screen. We will be accepting a total of 3 questions for the panelists. We are delighted to have Sabir Hussain Chaudhry, member of the Bangladesh Parliament, Dhaka 9 constituency, and honorary president of Interparliamentary Union, an active parliamentarian and now serving his 4th term. He is the current chair of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. He is also a member of the Parliamentary Committee on Ministry of Planning. He initiated a proposal for a new provision in the Constitution of Bangladesh relating to the protection and improvement of the environment and biodiversity as one of the fundamental principles of state policy. He successfully moved the parliamentary motion on planetary emergency, highlighting climate change, intensity and frequency of disasters, resource sustainability, loss of ecosystem, food security, and water stress. Mr. Hussain has excelled in various roles and responsibilities in parliament, government, political party, and sports administration, and is committed to fostering social equity in Bangladesh. Mr. Hussain Chaudhry will deliver the keynote to today's session, touching on the need to redesign the ways we think about economy and well-being in the context of Bangladesh, one of the most climate vulnerable countries today. So I will hand it over to Mr. Chaudhry to give the keynote address.
Thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure to be with you today, and greetings to everyone. I know we have an audience which is well beyond the confines of what we refer to the Eastern Himalayas. There are people from Argentina as well as the US and other countries who are joining us. So I will not try to say good morning or good afternoon or good evening. I'll just say greetings from Dhaka. And thank you also to the Balipara Foundation for organizing this dialogue and inviting me. For those of you who are expecting sort of a written script and me reading from it, that's not going to happen. I think it's less of a keynote and more of a conversation that I will try to engage in terms of how I see this whole question. And of course, there are a number of dimensions. One of that is how we look at GDP, how we define growth, what does growth actually mean? How do we get sustainability? And those questions, I think, have become more pressing in view of recent developments. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has actually challenged us to rethink development, to look at how we can forge new partnerships and new alliances. How do we allocate our resources, where those resources should go to? And it also coincides with the UN decade on restoration of ecosystems, which I think is another indication of how the world is relooking at this relationship. Now, the issue with GDP as a criteria for growth, of course, has been challenged also in the past, and there have been various discourses on that. The fact that it is only based on economics means that it doesn't capture the well-being aspect of it. It doesn't capture, how happy we are, how comfortable we are with life as it goes. And now, of course, health is being defined as well after the global pandemic. So I think a lot of questions are now being asked. And this is a very appropriate time and a very opportune time to relook at those issues. You have also very kindly talked about my engagement when it comes to the provision in the Constitution of Bangladesh, where we actually focused on the needs of the future generation. So how do we use our resources in a way that is also not going to prejudice their use of resources when it's their time. And the motion on planetary emergency was quite unique in Bangladesh because this was done at a time when other countries were looking at the emergency and the crisis strictly in terms of climate. But we actually took a broader perspective. So of course, there is climate, there is the frequency and intensity of disasters. There is also the issue of planetary overshoot that we have talked about. And this is in terms of, how we use our natural capital. How do we use the resource base that we have? So, and that planetary overshoot concept also brings in the issue of planetary justice, sustainability of resources. So these questions are now being asked. Side by side, I took part in a very interesting discussion a few days ago, where we are looking at ecocide as a crime, not just in terms of our national legislation, but also seeing whether we can bring it within the purview of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So I think there's a lot of discussion that's going on. And when we talk about the Eastern Himalayas, this, of course, is a very diverse region. It's a very important region. It is very rich in biodiversity. It has a large natural capital resource base that we all know about. So whether it is mountains, whether it is rivers, whether it is forests, whether it is ecosystems, this is a large part of the region. And so the challenges that we face in the Eastern Himalayas are in fact not just our challenges. I think these are challenges that the world as a whole faces. So I think what we are doing here can be in fact a trailblazer for how other regions and how other countries are looking at this whole issue of planetary resources and how we use them. In terms of bilateral relations, there is a lot that can be done. Bangladesh and India, I think way back in 2010, have actually signed an agreement at the prime ministerial level, where they talk about the very issues that we are talking about today. And I think that was quite visionary, because they talk about common management of common rivers, they talk about common management of common resources, they talk about the ecology, they talk about the environment. So I think there's a lot of discussion that has gone on. And what we really need to do now is to see how we can connect all those dots and bring them together. I think this is now the greatest challenge that we have. And of course, there is the other aspect which has also, I think, now come to the fore, and that is the United Nations Statistical Department, who have come up with this concept of system of economic and environmental accounting, where they are trying to bring the economy and the ecology also into play, rather than looking at it strictly in terms of economic growth and trying to define our GDP accordingly. So I think that's also something which is very interesting. That's something that Bangladesh is looking at very closely. And in fact, we have taken up a project in concert with the UN, as well as FAO and UNEP, where we are looking at these issues. So I think there's a lot of discussion that's going on. There's a lot of activity that's going on. And this region, the Eastern Himalayas, I think gives us a great opportunity for us to reinvent our relationship with nature, if you like. I think the fundamental question is, we can talk about the UN statistics and we can talk about GDP and other things, but at the end of the day, the most basic and the fundamental question that I think comes up is, how do we see ourselves in terms of our relationship with nature? Do we see ourselves as being embedded in nature? Do we see ourselves as being part of biodiversity? Do we see ourselves as being part of the ecosystem? So it is not just interconnectedness. I think it goes beyond that. It's more about togetherness and how we are able to see that relationship between us and nature. And we know that the natural capital base, although I don't have any statistics that I can actually refer to with authority, it has been diminished. I mean, if you look at the instance of Bangladesh, we have the mangrove forests in the Sundarbans. Now, if you look at what is the value of the carbon that is being stored there, it is close to $20 billion. In addition to that, every time we have had a natural disaster in Bangladesh, the Sundarban and the mangrove forests have actually acted as a shield and protected lives and livelihoods. So I think valuing that natural capital is going to be the first very important part, because I've always felt that, what we cannot measure, we cannot value. So I think measuring is very important. So do we first go about and have a baseline of what is the natural capital that we have here? And then we incorporate that into our national accounts, a system of accounting which actually acknowledges. So on the one hand, we have economic growth, and on the other, we have the pressure and the stress on the environment, the ecology, the ecosystem, the biodiversity. So I think having a scientific basis for that is going to be very important, because unless we are able to measure it, unless we are able to put a value to it, it's going to be very difficult to monitor whether our natural capital base is actually appreciating or depreciating. So I would see that as a very important first step. Then the other big issue is, how we look at trans-border and trans-boundary cooperation. I think this is really what we are talking about in the context of whether it's the Eastern Himalayas or any other region of the world, because nature doesn't respect natural boundaries. When you have a disaster striking, it doesn't say this is a part of India and this is a part of Bangladesh. I mean, it's going to hit you. And unless we really cooperate and collaborate, unless we have that approach when it comes to sharing our common resources, what we achieve individually as countries or nations is always going to be far lesser than what we can achieve collectively as a group of country and as a group of nation. So I think that is a very fundamental mindset change that we need across the board for the policymakers, because unless you see it that way, and transboundary in the past has been dominated by the concept of causing no harm. But how do you extend that concept of causing no harm to actually collaborating and cooperating, so that what you achieve together is far greater than what you can achieve individually? So I think that is a very important exercise that we need to do. And through these dialogues, I think we build that evidence base, because we know the very important interaction between science and evidence and data, statistics and policies. So unless we can have evidence-based policies, we are again going to be left behind. And we know that this region in particular, this is home to close to 250 million people. You have just as many probably ethnic communities, something like 220. It's extremely rich in biodiversity. I know for a fact that if you look at the global hotspots of biodiversity, the Myanmar, India, Chittagong Hill Tracts area is one of the most diverse in the world. So there are a lot of biological hotspots also. So can we use this as an entry point into re-looking at our relationship with nature? How can we look after communities? And this is not rocket science. Communities have done this over the years. So trying to get that indigenous knowledge into play. And knowledge is in the latest chip from Silicon Valley. It is what communities know. So how can we harness that knowledge and try to recalibrate our relationship nature, redefine our relationship nature in a concept of togetherness? I actually go beyond interconnectedness, because interconnectedness gives the impression that it is not an overall holistic approach. There are only certain areas where we connect, but I think it has to be complete togetherness, and it has to be at sync with the concept of us being embedded in nature. I think that is very, very important. And the moment we are able to see the relationship in those terms, the way we see nature at the moment is maybe it is something distant. The way we look at biodiversity, in terms of protecting that, we think that, oh, it's some species that we have to protect. But when we talk about biodiversity, we are really talking about ourselves. When we talk about protecting ecosystems, we are talking about protecting ourselves, fortifying ourselves. And now with zoonosis being a major issue, the way there's habitat loss, the way there is deforestation, the way diseases are jumping from the animal world onto our world, and the implications for that in terms of public health is actually forcing us and challenging us to relook at this whole relationship. So I think there are many aspects, and I don't think it would be appropriate for me when we have some very experienced individuals and resource persons who are going to add much more context to this discussion to go into individual. But I think what is important for me is for us to change our mindset. It is for us to look at nature in a completely new light. Is for us to look at ourselves as being a part of nature rather than being distinct and separate from it. And then in that concept of togetherness, find ways and solutions forward. And what better region in the world to start than the Eastern Himalayas? And we already know that, we are under pressure. We know the impacts of climate change. I mean, if I talk about the glaciers and the glacial melt in the Himalayas, the impact that has across the system. We have flooding in the short term. But if you look at the Himalayas as being the water towers of South Asia, 700, 800 million people are depending on it. What happens when the ice goes? Where do we get our sources of freshwater supply? And so I think this is where, diplomacy, transboundary relations, transboundary cooperation, looking at nature, looking at how we define that relationship, how we measure growth, how we factor in other aspects. Bhutan has the gross national happiness. You also have the Human Development Index. There are so many other alternatives. But I think all of these, the fundamental premise that we have to start is how we view nature, how we see ourselves as being a part of nature, and how do we want to see that relationship evolve. I think if we are able to do that, then all of the other aspects that we are talking about, the details that we are talking about, the ecosystems that we talk about, the common assets and the capital that we share across the region will then come into play. I'm not sure how much or how well I'm doing for time, but I think that's what I would like to say. It's more, as I say, a conversation to set the scene and just highlight and focus some of the areas which I think are important in terms of a starting off point. Of course, once you have got the roots in place and once you have your canvas, I think it's very easy to see how we start and where we go from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary, for that powerful introduction to today's conversation. We are delighted to have an eminent panel bringing unique experiences from around the world with us today to share their thoughts on rewilding, well-being, and equity. Without further delay, let me make a quick introduction to our panelists for today's session. Pem Lama is a director at the Bhutan Ecological Society, a nonprofit organization that connects science, business, and policy with the goal of building and sustaining resilient communities and functional landscapes. She has worked at the Asian Development Bank, International Institute for Sustainable Development, Secretariat for the New Development Paradigm, and Bhutan Foundation in areas of economic development, green public procurement, sustainable consumption and production, societal well-being, and gross national happiness. She is passionate about building a more sustainable and inclusive world and enjoys exploring the inner dimensions, individual mindsets and behavior, and outer dimensions, systems and institutions that affect and shape the world we live in. Diana Friedrich is the program coordinator for Rewilding Argentina's Patagonia Azul program. She coordinated fieldwork at the Hooded Grebe Project, Avis Argentina, and volunteered as field technician at the Great Anteater Reintroduction Project in the Iberia wetlands. She has studied nature conservation in South Africa with practical experience in wildlife reserves in Zimbabwe and Kenya. An adventurer and naturalist, Diana has volunteered with Greenpeace in Buenos Aires and conservation programs in Argentina and Bolivia. Lastly, Helena Norberg-Hodge is a pioneer at the New Economy movement and recipient of the Alternative Nobel Prize, the Arthur Morgan Award, and Goi Peace Prize for contributing to the revitalization of cultural and biological diversity and the strengthening of local communities and economies worldwide. She is the author of the inspirational classic Ancient Futures and Local is Our Future. She is co-author of Bringing the Food Economy Home and From the Ground Up, and producer of the award-winning documentary, The Economics of Happiness. Helena is the founder and director of Local Futures and the International Alliance for Localization, and a founding member of the International Commission on Future of Food and Agriculture, the International Forum on Globalization, and the Global Eco-Village Network. Opening up the panel, I would first come to Pem. With your previous work and now, could you elaborate a little on the indicators of progress and well-being, especially in context to Bhutan? How do we understand alternative definitions of progress and well-being?
Thank you so much, Benita, and good afternoon and good morning to all. It's an honor to be on the panel with Elena, especially, who has, I think, known this part of the world and worked here for a very long time. So, and also thank you to the Baldipara Foundation for having me as a panelist here. Just want to caveat this by saying that I think no expert on GNH as a maybe a development practitioner. I have some ideas through the course of my work. And so I'll talk a little bit about, how GNH is broadly applied in Bhutan. And then maybe I'll move a little bit into how that manifests in the work that we do that relates to ecological and environmental conservation here in Bhutan. So for those that are tuning in who are hearing gross national happiness for the first time, I hope it isn't, but if it is your first time, then it stands for gross national happiness is Bhutan's development philosophy. It is sort of the guiding principle for how we want to approach progress. And the term GNH is attributed to the fourth king of Bhutan, who apparently at some international conference, when he was asked about what's the GDP of Bhutan, had responded that GNH is more important than GDP. So that's sort of the origins of GNH. But of course, there are, I think, other forces and other individuals who had also, I think, talked a lot about well-being and happiness and GNH. So I think as our Honorable MP just mentioned earlier, I think Bhutan is not the only country that is looking at well-being and happiness and alternatives to GDP. I think it's happening all over the world. But I think Bhutan was one of the earliest, if I may say so, in that when it was first developing, when we were developing in the 1960s, 70s, when we were opened, when our country opened to development, that we had, or our leadership, I should say, had the conscience to think about, what that means, what growth means when we started building roads and schools and opening our country to trade and development. I think there was this conscious effort to see what we wanted to take in and what we wanted to keep out of Bhutan. So gross national happiness, I think it implies that progress can be multidimensional and it can be holistic. And I think this is an important realization now, but I think for Bhutan was for a while ago that there are many non-economic aspects to well-being and progress, and that GDP is a very limited measure. GNH in Bhutan, with that sort of idea, manifests in many different ways. And so I'll take you a little bit through what that actually means for us, because I think you may have heard the word, but you may not know how it is used or applied in Bhutan. So first of all, GNH is just a wide development philosophy, an overarching goal that is, I think, scattered across all policy documents and a lot of speeches, as well as a lot of the, I think, ideology of what organizations adopt. So they will always look at, various aspects of GNH, which I will discuss a little later. It is also used as a policy screening tool, which is that a lot of the policies and projects, whatever Bhutan seeks to introduce, is passed through the screening tool. And it's not a yes or no, it passes or not kind of a tool, but it's more of a way of looking at this policy or a particular project from a very holistic point of view and say, how does it affect our education, our environment, the health, the role of women, the environment. So I think you ask all these questions that then allows you to have a much more nuanced way forward to applying that policy and adopting it. So yes, development philosophy, policy screening tool. It is also a tool for measurement, which I think is a little contentious, and we are not contentious, but it's still a work in progress, which is called the GNH index. Which has certain indicators as well as variables how and you measure that index. So let me tell you a little bit more about the four pillars of GNH. They are environment, good governance, culture preservation, and sustainable and equitable development. So these four pillars are much more, I would say, a wider sort of tool to have in your toolbox, where this is applicable to many different areas of doing your work. You can apply it the four pillars can be applied maybe in your own work, for example, in your institutes, in your policy documents. I think you can always look at different aspects of GNH through these four pillars. But when it comes to actually measurement and the index that I just mentioned, we have 9 domains, which gets a little bit more, I would say, nuanced. So we look at living standards, we look at good governance, education, health, ecology, community vitality, time use, culture, and psychological well-being. So these are the 9 domains of GNH. And so ecology fits in one of those. As you can see, a lot of those are much more human-centric, but the ecology and environment is a part of one of the 9 domains. And these are further sort of broken down into indicators and variables for each of the policy screening tool. And just to give you an example, some of these variables can be like looking at equity, looking at economic security, gender balance, pollution, land degradation, so I think really depending on what kind of policies and projects that you are looking at, these 9 domains can be broken down and expanded into different variables. So I don't know if that's a little technical for the audience here, but just wanted to kind of let you know that it does get a little technical. It's not just a pie in the sky idea, that we actually look at various dimensions. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but if I have a little bit more time, I can explain. Okay, great. So yeah, with all of these tools, like how is it relevant to well-being and ecology, let's say, And I think for that, actually GNH, because this is the umbrella sort of ideology for Bhutan, environment protection has always been a very strong focus for the government. And in fact, a lot of our national rules and regulations have very, very high conservation angle to it. We have a 60%, in the Constitution, we are mandated to have 60% of forest cover at all times. So such type of strong rules have now resulted from such ideology. So our laws and regulations have a much more, I think, stronger environmental focus, which I think in the rest of the world didn't really happen at the time of their development. So because of those laws and regulations, a lot of the development activities are checked already because environment is a strong focus, and ecology and diversity is already, I think, much more given as much attention as to economic dimensions of well-being. I think I'll discuss a little bit more of the practical applications of it a little later, but I think I'll leave it to that for now. Thank you, Benita.
Thank you, Pam, for highlighting about the GNH. We all know about the ways that it has been revolutionary in the way we see development. But of course, there are challenges, and about it, I'll come back to you later for that. Moving on to Diana. You have worked with Rewilding Argentina to reintroduce giant anteaters and macaws, and currently you coordinate the Patagonia Azul project. In continuation to what Pen spoke, as we look for what are the ways that we look for alternative ways to progress, can you share some of your experiences, possibly elaborating on the challenges of implementing or trying to implement a large-scale model of development which may not be suitable for a region, and then understanding rewilding as a means or to rebuilding the relationship between ecology and communities?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much to have me here. I must say I'm super honored to be here sharing these things with you guys. I am very young and I have very little experience yet, and I am very much inspired by everything you do all over the world. So I'm very happy to be here and talk about these alternative ways to progress. And I love to agree on that there is not one way to progress, but so many different ones, maybe as many as there are communities in the world, right? I think the challenge of talking or thinking about large development or conservation models is the risk of tending to think that there is one big solution for one big problem that we're currently in, for example, climate change or biodiversity loss. and it sort of doesn't acknowledge the diversity of the world and the different scale of the problem and the different ways of trying to find solution in every different little context. And it's also very hard to imagine for me, right? A model that can be applied as a solution for the whole of climate change, for example. So what I find is that we always try to think of that big solution, while it is within us to find. What I do in Patagonia is I try to find all these little ideas and then go back to the territory where I live in, where I'm part of the community, and bring them down and see them from down there, from the local context with the people that I share this environment with, and then thinking of how we can implement these little ideas there. And so at this organization, Rewilding Argentina, we work at protecting large areas of land in Argentina, because laws and regulations are not like in Bhutan very much oriented towards natural protection, but rather against it, sadly. So we dedicate a lot of effort to purchasing land and donating to the state in order to pass laws that protect that in perpetuity. And a large part of protecting the natural environments that we have is rewilding them, and in the sense of the word, that means bringing back the species that have already gone extinct locally in those areas. For example, in the Ibera wetlands, like, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 species went locally extinct and are currently being brought back there. And just to go into that, I've been part of the Anteater reintroduction project and the Macaw introduction project, and I was just doing the field work. But I know that the most important part of that work was not to bring the animals back, but to promote that change in society where people would ask for those species to come back, see them as a part of the ecosystem and of their culture more than everything. Because if they didn't, it would be the same problem. And I call that, I find that sense of rewilding much more beautiful. As was said before, we need to be rewilded in our souls, I think. We need to go back into nature and feel part of it and not a part. Not think that we are going to save something or bring some species back because then the ecosystem is going to work. We need to be part of that ecosystem. I think that is the most important aspect of rewilding, and that is what brings well-being. I can't even imagine how did we get to think that the economic well-being is bringing us anything, or the measurement of well-being in economic terms. How did that even occur to us that's the most important thing? So this gross happiness index is so much more I don't know how to say this. It's so much more creative and assertive and right for the local context of communities. So I think the most important work we do here in Patagonia now is, having learned of the other projects where species were brought back. Here in Patagonia, we don't have extinct species. So what I do mostly is bringing the people back to what's theirs. This little town where I work in, it's just a little community of less than 2,000 people, and they surround it by the ocean and the Patagonian steppe. And those are both environments that are not a very abundant forest or something that is very obviously abundant and biodiverse and productive. This is an environment that is harsh and that has been desertified also for a long time. So people don't even know what they can produce there. So we have brought agroecology and permaculture into their local language, into their local culture. We are bringing holistic range management into their local culture. And we are talking about marine permaculture to just show them that the ecosystem they inhabit is so much more productive, and that they can be part of it by regenerating it, by actively being a positive ecosystem engineer, and not being part of the destruction of the environment, but being part of the regeneration rather, and therefore being a part, feeling connected to it, and feeling like a purpose in their lives, which is what globalization doesn't give you, right? A purpose, a feeling that you belong, a feeling that you are different, that you can do things in your environment and that is unique to where you are. So I think that is the most important aspect of rewilding, and I hope I have answered the question with this. That is how we rebuild the relationship between ecology and the communities.
Thank you, Diana, for providing us with an insight into rewilding as a way of rebuilding relationships between ecology and community. I couldn't agree more about economics not being the only measure of progress, and I think most of us here would agree with you on that. We can possibly discuss the ways forward towards the end of our discussion. Now coming to Helena, your work has been inspiring for many people over the last 40 years of your engagement with promoting the economics of personal, ecological, and social well-being. One of the most inspiring works has been based in Ladakh, which provides solution to the unintended impacts of development in smaller communities. So when we speak of rebuilding this relationship, in the previous case by rewilding, through your work, what do you consider to be the essentials of economic localization, or being able to decentralize the forces of global economic changes and create or rebuild relationships we take for granted? What do you consider to be the essential components of this well-being, and how can we counter them through localization?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, previous speakers, for elaborating on what I essentially see as this picture, the information that we need to move towards what I often call the economics of happiness, which is synonymous with the economics of both human and ecological well-being. As our Honorable MP was talking about, the deep connection to nature, where we recognize that what happens to nature is what happens to us, that we are truly a part of nature. This is an understanding that is growing worldwide. There is absolutely no doubt that in the more industrialized, urbanized parts of the world, as people moved away from a deep connection to nature, they started developing a longing for coming back home to their real home in the natural world. So we can see a clear path. And we know also that in communities like Bhutan and Ladakh and many rural communities throughout the world, where people have never left that more land-based, nature-based way of living, there is the idea that life in the city, life in the consumer culture is superior and is better. So I think a critical part of the way forward is much deeper dialogue between these two parts of the global population. And it's probably roughly half and half, because throughout the so-called developing world, there's already a turning away from the cities. COVID has, of course, encouraged this even further. But already we've seen people who lived in Mumbai or in any of the big cities beginning to understand that this was a type of death. They were so alienated from nature, and paradoxically, as human beings were pushed into large cities and living right on top of each other, they suddenly didn't look each other in the eye. They didn't smile and say, how are you? They didn't know each other's names. So simultaneously, as people were alienated from nature, they were alienated from each other. It's in more cohesive, smaller communities that people connect to each other and to nature. So the path of rewilding is actually a path of localization, very much as Diana was describing. It is the rebuilding of a community fabric, where human beings connect more deeply to each other and to the natural world. Economic localization is a structural, pragmatic, economic way of re-establishing that interdependence, a world where we are dependent on human scale institutions, people whose names we know, people whose actions we recognize, we see. We're creating more accountable, visible, smaller scale economic units. And by doing that, we're creating more human scale political units. The political power and the economic power are inseparable. Part of what we must do is to look more clearly at how the path of globalization is still continuing. We have to alert the UN and all the well-intentioned people working there to critically look at and to question the mechanisms whereby global corporations and banks are gaining more and more power over national governments, more and more power over our worldview, over our science, over our schooling, really over every avenue of knowledge. We urgently need to understand that the internet has become a tool much more for centralized top-down forces than a tool of decentralization. We're using the internet now. We need to use it to communicate as we are, but we also need to be talking about the way in which we can genuinely reestablish more decentralized, localized structures. The paradox is that to do that effectively, we need more international collaboration. And for right now, that means depending on the internet and the tools that it offers. But part of what we're trying to foment is a discussion where we realize that we do not need to move into 5G. We don't need to speed up even further, because in doing so, we're actually supporting the global players more than we are the local players. And this is, again, in terms of moving towards genuine respect for diversity, genuine rewilding, both human and ecological. We're talking about the deep respect for the individual, the uniqueness of every human, the uniqueness of every plant, the uniqueness of the languages that flourished as people were in a deeper dialogue with nature. Excuse me. The deeper dialogue between humans and nature was the reason for cultural diversity, for linguistic diversity, the homogenization through which we are becoming one consumer culture, a competitive, fearful, superficial consumer culture, where each and every individual feels inadequate, feels imperfect, doesn't feel that they measure up to the standard of what it is to be human. That has come through this top-down force of centralization. And from the very beginning, it's been commercial forces. It was the slave traders that also enclosed populations in Europe, pushing them away from the land into cities to become cheap labor, and then using slavery on the other side of the world. This global system from the beginning used force. Now it operates more through seduction. So these are complicated issues, but we really need to talk about them. And we need to talk about them in an empathetic, compassionate way. It's not about good people and bad people. Smaller scale, slower ways of living are without a doubt what we need to move towards if we're going to survive and if we're going to replenish diversity. But we need to approach this through an understanding of the systemic forces without demonizing people or individuals in big corporations or banks, but simply spelling out things the way they are. So our work in Local Futures is about trying to do that and about establishing international collaborative structures. We launched last year what we call World Localization Day. And we're collaborating with 30 countries and with numerous groups in those countries to celebrate and make visible the localization movement that is emerging despite support from the top. There's a bottom-up movement led by women. At the center of it is local food economies. And I very much like to hear what you said, Diana, about bringing in permaculture and even, you know, because you're bringing back the understanding that people can live off the natural world without destroying it. And once there is that connection, that practical connection done in an with experiential localized knowledge, respecting the species that thrive in specific ecosystem, you can rebuild those deeper relationships in a truly productive way for genuine growth, for genuine productive growth that can benefit human beings. I've probably gone over my time now, have I?
But I will come back to you on that little bit.
Okay.
But it was not a lot, or just 1 minute, so it was fine. Yes, thanks a lot and for your insightful words. And I think it was very interesting for all of us to hear, and it allows us to see the tangible parts and aspects of, you know, everything that we're speaking about and the relevance on the ground. So we probably got lost in it. But okay, coming back to, so situating the conversation on rebuilding resilient communities and fostering well-being in the context of the Eastern Himalayas, I will be coming back to Pem now and asking you what are the challenges in the implementation on the ground of the understandings of growth and progress, or the National Happiness Index, and how do we include rural and indigenous communities in decision-making processes on conservation, and how do we aim for this more holistic model?
Thank you for that question, Benita. I think, yeah, there are lots of challenges. I think Bhutan has a wonderful vision, but translating that vision into proper action on the ground has lots of challenges. And I think the first and foremost, I think I would begin higher at the ideological level, because the GNH fundamentally is, I think, a different idea. It takes a different ideology that the well-being of society, like collective well-being, is greater than, let's say, individual well-being of, you know, individual advancement, let's say. So this fundamental change, I think, is really hard to permeate to the rest of the world, and even maybe among ourselves, you know. So I think I read somewhere which said that the, you know, as we have all talked about in this panel today, the globalization as a force is a big one. And I think sort of for Bhutan kind of moving into the global big force, like homogenizing ourselves to the rest of the world, is actually quite contradictory to what GNH stands for. Ideologically, psychologically, I think it's actually very contradictory. So I think that is the main big challenge, I would say, that Bhutan is a very, very small country with maybe a great idea, but we are still functioning in a global village where capitalism as well as market forces are still what dictates, you know, what happens. So I think to function in that environment, I think Bhutan has to be very, Bhutan has to be quite, I would say, considered in how we want to develop and how we want to go forward. So just translating our vision in the global context is difficult. That's number one. The other challenge, I think, practically for Bhutan is that GNH, although it is an idea that was developed the concept was phrased in 1970s, and since then we have put GNH concept into a lot of policy documents. But still, I think you know, up until this day, the idea of GNH is not necessarily translated properly into all aspects of life. It is a good maybe policy tool, it's a screening tool, it is used by researchers for indexing, but this idea of I think an alternate measure of progress has still not necessarily permeated to all aspects of life. And I think that translation, because it's lost somewhere, I think it's very hard for us to find real changes, to see real changes in our country country. And I think the other aspect of challenge for GNH is that a lot of our policy making, as well as whatever concepts we hear about, are still borrowed from, I would say, the developed world. Including, I think, our personal aspirations at an individual level. So as Elena just mentioned, I think we still, as Bhutanese, see the Western world and the comfort and the progress as something to aspire for. And this whole connection to, appreciating the biodiversity we have. I mean, Bhutan is known to be one of the most biodiverse, hotspots of the world. We have 10 protective areas. I think more than half of the whole country is actually protected. So there is a lot to appreciate about us. And yet, if you ask a local Bhutanese, I think we still aspire for more than this. So I think just the challenge between translation as well as sort of this individual aspiration are two things that really, I think, pose a big hurdle for us to move forward. On your question on how we can, include like communities or empower communities in this rewilding process, or, to be, I think, an authority in terms of conserving our local nature. I think for Bhutan's context, from what I know, I think it goes both ways. On one hand, they are partners in conservation. They are very much receptive to new ideas. For example, if there's organic farming, or other such or agroecology. So when these concepts are introduced, I think they're receptive to it. But at the same time, I think recognizing the capacities on the ground is very important. A lot of these indigenous societies do have, I would say, traditional knowledge and skill sets to understand their local environmental context. But at the same time, I think this is being diluted by all the new knowledge of different things that they have heard or different aspirations. So a lot of the indigenous knowledge is also actually being diluted, and it's replaced by maybe, let's say, you can grow X number of crops more. Maybe it's not the traditional variety, but if you use this new innovative, farming methodology, then you can grow more. So I think we are confused in terms of where to go. And this is very, I think, similar to the Bhutan's context as a whole, as a country, that we have this great aspiration, we have a great wisdom in terms of what we want, but how we get there is so confusing, because I think the entire world right now is still in the process of figuring it out. So even for Bhutan, at every level, it's very confusing to know, because every new, every year or every month there is something new out there. Lots of different concepts when it comes to ecological preservation, climate change, agroecology. So I think we just are kind of floating in a sea of where do we go, and balancing that is quite challenging. But how do we then get to I think making that change and shifting, as I think Diana and Elena have talked about, to localizing, to understanding, to creating that connection. I think for Bhutan, we are actually not too far from it. But at the same time, I think we need much more conscious efforts to first reinstate some of the wisdom that already exists, maybe in our local communities and the local knowledge, but also to learn from the new knowledge out there, the new research, new innovations that relate to going back to nature, and that's one thing. And the other thing, which is much more, I think, in economics term, although I think it's an ideological debate, but if we want to make smaller shifts, I think incentivizing local communities to conserve becomes one of the bigger currencies we can use. So I mean, there are lots of different methodologies like payment of ecosystems these days. So I think those type of newer ideologies and incentivizing some of the local communities to move towards like being conservation partners, I think would be, the steps to move forward. I hope I've answered some of your questions there.
Thank you, Pam, for great insights on the nuances at play. and involving working with communities and the processes. Now coming to Diana, I would more or less ask the same question, but in context to your work, and how do we include Indigenous communities in decision-making in terms of that, and in the process of biodiversity and natural assets through rewilding, and the importance of rebuilding what we consider to be taken for granted aspects of development and economic models, rethinking the ways of engagement and the pivots of these models in context to Argentina.
Okay, it's just started raining, so I hope the noise doesn't disturb my voice. So in my context, I have to start again by saying that the problem in the community where I work is that they're surrounded by abundance and they don't know it, because first, the land is privatized by huge landowners that do sheep ranching on the land. And so there is a protected area along the whole coastline. And most of the population of that little town has never even accessed that coastline because it's just closed off for public access. So the first thing we do here with Rewilding Argentina is open that, and open it in order to show people that what they have is actual abundance and beauty and like the most breathtaking landscape on the whole coast of Argentina that they don't know about, that they read about in newspapers from elsewhere, that they are called the Galapagos of Argentina, and they don't even know what Galapagos is, but I mean, that is how uninformed they are about what where they live and what their home is. So I think it's been said that we need to measure in order to know what to protect, but here we need to get to know it first in order to protect and to incentivize to conserve. What are they going to conserve if they don't even know what's there, you know? So that is one of the most important things, I think, of empowering people, of making them part of decisions. It's a great risk for me to come as a big, large organization from elsewhere and knowing so much about the world and talking about conservation and about climate change and about things that they don't even realize are a problem out there maybe, and coming and bringing them all kinds of solutions that they don't even need in their hearts and minds because they're not informed enough about this and they don't feel it in their local context. So what I first did is very humbly, I just tried to be part of the community, to make friends, to be a neighbor of them, to know how their local context is and what their real worries are. And that is so important to me about this organization. We always live there, the teams live in the territory where they work and they are a part of that community and they know exactly what is happening to each of the neighbors of that small community. So from there on, after 1 year of just being there and living in the community, I started gathering my new friends and with them thinking about what the problems were. And so we created together a group that we call the transition group, because we actually follow that global transition movement, which again, I love that dilemma that we have about global collaboration versus globalization. Obviously, the transition network is a very useful thing to adapt to the local context, right? Because it's not a big model that they bring down to you, but it's just a few guidelines and ways of connecting to nature and to your community. So we did that, and then the pandemic hit. And the first thing that was so obvious to us is that we need to be food secure. We need to secure this little town that is so isolated in case of the pandemic stopping the food from coming in. So if that happened, as said everywhere, in 4 days, the shelves would have been empty. And what use is a national park or a protected area if if people are going to be hungry, and obviously I'm not going to stop them from going there and hunting everything that runs around there. And that is also not the solution, because that's going to be over in some days too. And then, so we started this big agroecology permaculture project. And the most amazing result of that was that people engaged, people started coming to this place that the municipality gave us, to connect with each other, to talk to each other, to see how lettuce is planted and how carrots grow and how we were advancing. And it's all voluntary work. It's all just time from us that we spend with our neighbors. And that is the most amazing result that I got. And that, I think, is the most empowering thing, that people realize that their food is a problem because they don't know how to grow it. And that, yeah, there are some people that go and fish, but they don't live on that. And then the big industry that is in Camarones is the fishing industry, which obviously gives a lot of employment. And for me, that is more a problem than a solution, because that just makes them dependent on this extractive system that is part of the globalized world, and that has nothing to do with the local context, and that just extracts resources, and that makes people, some people, comfortable or just numb in their jobs, and they stop thinking about going further and doing something more for their community. And I think that is the big problem that we have now. But what makes me so hopeful is that by creating agroecology projects and holistic management on the ranches surrounding us, and permaculture, marine permaculture, we show people that there are so many other things that they can do. And that also creates a lot of jobs where they connect and where they talk to each other, and where they realize that what is important is not the money, but their well-being and their health. And I think that is also something we can learn from the pandemic. It has taught us that health is a real thing that you can measure, and that is much more important than economy, and that the economy is not helping us to be more healthy at all. So yeah, I think valuing every individual and relearning all the lost or forgotten skills, recognizing the value of communal relationships and the capacities that are there. I think that gives back all the self-respect and self-love and the love for their home that they now know. And that creates a whole different feeling for people of pride, of wanting to belong there and to stay. And I think that's very important in this world where everyone tries to go to the big cities, where we who come from the big cities, at least I know exactly that I don't want to be there, but I can't tell them. They need to feel that in their own bones, I think. So yeah, that is, I think, the way of empowering communities.
Thank you, Diana, for the fascinating exploration and your experience of actual lives and the ways that we listen to your work with Rewilding Argentina to build practical roots of participatory decision-making and alternative economies. Now coming back to Elena, your most recent work, Local is Our Future, Steps to an Economics of Happiness, outlines how a systematic economic shift from global to local can address the world's social, economic, ecological, and spiritual crisis. When we speak about rebuilding relationships towards nature and rewilding, how do you think this can be linked to processes of localization, and how can they help each other?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be clear that we need to support both bottom-up initiatives, very much along the line of what Diana was talking about. And I hope, Diana, you know about our resources, because we've been promoting local food systems for about 30 years and helped to start farmers markets and initiatives around the world, and found exactly as you're finding, that is one of the most effective mechanisms for starting to heal both people and the planet. So we need to support those bottom-up initiatives. And I would argue that once we step back and understand the main cause of climate change, of cultural breakdown, of the mountains of plastic, toxicity through pesticides and cancer, the epidemic of obesity, and the loss of democracy, we will understand that the global food system is the biggest contributor to all of these crises. And so that supporting and enhancing and rebuilding more localized food economies worldwide is the single most important thing we can do. And the wonderful thing is that through mainly women from the grassroots up, this is happening all around the world. And once we see how much is happening without any significant help from government, neither from the UN nor from any government bodies, not from the global media, almost no funding and no support from the bottom up. These are people-led initiatives that are demonstrating that when you shorten the distance between the farm and the market, you actually create a market that pressures the growers towards diversification. So this is one of the most significant structural understandings we need to have, because what has happened is that through this few hundred years trajectory of creating an artificial market supported by heavy subsidies, which I'll come back to, this global market, which was created through force, has always been based on encouraging monoculture instead of diversification. And by encouraging monoculture on the land, this system has essentially become anti-life. Fundamental principle of life is diversity. The uniqueness that I was talking about before, that is a fact of life, it's a principle of life, and we have a market, we have an economic system that is in direct contradiction to that. It's anti-life. So we absolutely must shift in the direction of localizing as a way of supporting life itself, starting with biodiversity, as I'm just saying. But what we're also seeing is that as communities can become a bit more self-reliant and more in charge of their own affairs, they're also able to cultivate, respect, and rebuild that cultural diversity and even the individual human diversity and the self-respect that comes with that. So human scale, intergenerational communities adapted to and living with the land, that's how we evolved. It's in our DNA. There's more and more evidence that's showing that most of our trauma that is now becoming much more obvious, most of the neuroses, mental health problems and so on, come from the breakdown of intergenerational community and the breakdown of our connection to nature. So we're talking now about, again, an absolute need for reconnection. So we need to support, we need to make more visible these bottom-up initiatives with a primary focus on food. We can build on that, which is what's happened in the localization movement that we have pioneered in globally, all around the world. And this is where our departure, unlike the transition time movement, which started much later, and the sort of initial focus for them was peak oil, which unfortunately didn't happen because the globalizing path has artificially supported a monopolistic market. Come back to that. But the bottom-up movement now also consists of building on the foundations of local food to create community-based energy systems, to create buy local alliances, to create a support for local businesses, and even for local finance. And there are various mechanisms that are being used to do that. Even just a group of consumers coming together, wanting to support this healthier economy And as Diana said, with the recognition that the supermarket shelves might be empty in a matter of days, there has been a real push for more localized food economies, particularly in COVID. And that has included also respect for protecting and preserving local seed varieties, open pollinated seeds that can be regenerated. So all of this is happening around the world. We need to make it visible. We need to support it. We also need to focus on the very simple, clear policy steps that governments could take if there is enough civic society pressure. And they are to look at what is taxed, what is subsidized, and what is regulated. These three mechanisms that governments use to shape the economy, to determine whether a carrot from 1,000 miles away is cheaper than a carrot from 1 mile away, to determine what now has nothing to do with efficiency, nothing to do with supply and demand, but essentially our governments have become locked into subsidizing monopolies that don't pay tax, and they are the global players. Those same players are being deregulated, having regulations removed through trade treaties. Now, shifting taxes, subsidies, and regulations to support instead local, regional, national players could lead to genuinely circular, healthy economies. That's what we need to do. And I think the time is now. It's beginning to happen. I'm so encouraged by seeing some of this getting into the mainstream media, because it's been very difficult to get it in there. But I was happy to be featured in the New York Times recently, and there's been, you know, I've seen now things in the BBC and the Guardian, and people like Jane Goodall and Russell Brand and Gabor Mate, some of these people you may not have heard of, that people have started joining our movement for this shift from global to local. And I very much hope that we can all collaborate to help support this shift and to do it in a movement that we mustn't confuse international collaboration with economic globalization. Remember, economic globalization is removing taxes for global monopolies and deregulating global monopolies, while almost every local business, particularly local farming, is heavily overregulated in a very counterproductive way. We would all be happy to have regulations that reduce pesticides, for instance. That's not what's happening. In the name of public health and safety, there are all kinds of crazy regulations that make it too expensive for small farmers to survive. So we need clear heads and well-intentioned people who understand the absolute relationship between human well-being and ecological well-being to examine these regulations and make this transition happen as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. So my next question is still for you. So building on that, how do we understand the link between well-being and localization, and how do we understand or support well-being through localization for the future?
Well, the understanding, for me, one of the most heartwarming experiences has been to get feedback from around the world about the benefits, particularly of localization, again, around food. We have witnessed that delinquent teenagers, prisoners, hardened prisoners, mentally ill people, torture victims, have healed themselves as they have been helped to connect in community structures. And again, remember, community structures are intergenerational. You don't have this segregation into peer groups, which is very destructive, that modern education has brought in. So in these community food initiatives, be they community gardens, be they projects where local food initiatives are encouraged through local farmers markets, and a number of other initiatives that very often also happen around schools, that they involve the parents as well as the children. What we're seeing is that there's the magic of the deeper human connection, but there's also the magic of the connection to nature, which for me and for many people, you know, wild nature is my church, and it's how I rejuvenate myself regularly, by being out in nature as wild as possible. But what we've seen in terms of healing is that when people are helped to connect to each other in that collaborative, intergenerational way, and to connect to nature through productive gardening and actually being part of the magic of nature in this productive way, where you actually are doing something meaningful. You get a great deal of satisfaction of having planted a seed and being able to harvest a carrot or a head of lettuce. Again, my understanding of this is really that it is part of our DNA. For most of our time on this planet, we were engaged in that way, in that extraction from nature, but extraction based on that deep connection, where we could see that if we poisoned the water that we were about to drink, this wasn't serving us. The deeper, more localized ways of doing things inevitably were kinder to nature, kinder to other people and to ourselves. It's not a guarantee for perfect ecological behavior, perfectly peaceful behavior, but it's a prerequisite for more accountable and visible structures, where we see our connection to what we do to the land and the trees is what happens to us. So for instance, just keep in mind that you couldn't possibly in a town come up with a GDP measurement and have people sit and applaud the fact that every tree on the mountain has been clear cut. It wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't be possible to poison the water in the river so that no one could drink healthy water and call that progress. That could never happen traditionally. The measurement of GDP goes up when we clear cut, when we poison water so people have to buy it in bottles. Right now, Australia exports 20 tons of bottled water to the UK. The UK exports 20 tons of bottled water to Australia. This is madness. And it's a madness that's born of the abstractions of a globalized system where we're so distanced from the impact of our actions on ourselves and on nature that we can't see what we're doing. So the link between well-being and localization is very clear, and I urge everyone to study the new local. You have the old local in the villages of Bhutan or Ladakh, where I have spent 40 years of my life. And that old local still has so much knowledge and so much wisdom and so much knowledge about practices that worked often for hundreds of years. But as Pim will tell us, you know, people are getting confused, because when someone comes in from the outside and says, use this wonderful white powder that's going to make your crop flourish, they don't have the information that this is a toxic pesticide. So this is again why the link between the old local and the new local is so important. So study the new local and the new local food systems, and you will see evidence of the well-being that comes from those connections. And there's more and more evidence now that is emerging every day, but you have to go beyond the conventional sources of information. Come to our website. Local Futures is a website where you can do a PhD on localization.
Okay. Thank you, Helena. Now coming to Diana, speaking about envisioning a future through your experience with working in different projects, what would you consider to be certain ideals or values of action which would help us reestablish our relationship with nature or recreate our understandings of well-being?
Yeah, I don't think I can say anything new that Helena hasn't said already, but I think you can sum it up or say it in other words as it is about remembering our way forward. And I find it so beautiful. And I wanted to say the same, to talk about magic in the world. We need to remember that planting a seed and harvesting its fruits, it's magic. It is something that we cannot measure. That is just our well-being, to see that happen, to be the ones that do that. And another thing I wanted to say is, I don't know if it's extraction what we did, or it's more reciprocity what used to be done, right? So economies are now based on the concept of scarcity instead of the concept of abundance. And so the whole economy is based on the need to commodify nature and to create an artificial scarcity. So as Helena said, cutting down forests increases the GDP, and poisoning the water increases the scarcity of available water and forces us to buy bottled water from corporations who are actually the ones who are poisoning the water. And it seems like it could be on purpose. Maybe it isn't, but that's how we are organizing ourselves. And I think that is the problem. So I am definitely going onto that Local Futures website, and I want to learn more about localizing, because I agree so much on that. That is the way that we need to focus on together and intergenerationally remember how to produce our food in each of our environments, remember how to use the natural materials to build our homes, remember how to make our clothes, and produce community-based and most of all decentralized energy sources, while we engage with the government and examine the taxes and the subsidies and the regulations to actively promote localization. I think, and I can only bring this down to my context, where there is this big fish processing plant that employs about 100 people, which in a town of 2,000 people is very much. And so I imagine that the way to convince the government of taxing or of examining the subsidies and maybe redirectioning that towards the regenerational movement is to just create more jobs and more well-being and more social pressure to do that, right? So obviously help the people to be more independent of the government by producing their own food. I think that is a very important concept, to be free of that pressure of the government bringing you the food, otherwise you die or you go hungry, and just get involved with that by creating little and diverse solutions. So not just one agroecology project, but a lot, and not just agroecology, but also holistic management, and also marine ecology, and also the Ocean Club, and also the transition movement, all of it, like as many solutions as there are in the world, and everything is welcome. And then also get involved in actively protecting our resources and our landscapes, because obviously the risk of larger corporations coming and doing mining in the area or something, I think that is also a big risk. So we need to be prepared for that also. And then, yeah, just slowly shifting towards a more spiritual, more connected, and more magical perception of the world. I think by empowering women is also a very good way to achieve that, because there's very much magic in the relationships among women, and a lot of strength that is now hidden and silenced. But I think that is very important.
Okay. Thank you, Diana. So, Pem, to wrap this up, bringing us back to the question of GDP and alternatives, as you have already mentioned, the work on the ground with regard to the implementation of other indexes such as the GNH, what would you consider to be some of the indicators that would help us reevaluate not just our own ideas of progress, but also be able to have a slate which with slight modifications could be used in different parts of the world to measure progress?
Thank you, Benita. I think as I've mentioned before, I think GNH is just one of the alternatives, and there are many out there. I think I'm sure people have heard about, I think Happy Planet Index, Human Development Index. There is the Genuine Progress Indicators. There are lots of different indexes around the world that I think try to do what we are trying to doing, which is to bring in these other aspects, non-economic aspects of progress into our lives and how we measure our own development towards that progress. I think more than indicators, I think for Bhutan, what we genuinely have to offer the world is this idea, like I had mentioned before. I think GNH is an ideology that places collective well-being first. So I think number one, I think this idea of collective well-being and how that sometimes also has costs to individuals. Like maybe if we take it a very small example of, being living in harmony with our roommates or our families, for example, you can see that sometimes I think personally we might have to compromise on certain aspects to live in harmony, right, with each other. So I think that kind of concept, when it's taken to a national level or a global level, then we can understand the essence of what GNH is trying to say, where societal well-being is much more important. And I think that shift can really move sort of all of us from individual pursuits or corporations or financial gain of companies to more to a better accounting of other aspects which could be social as well as environmental aspects. So I think number one, that is the societal well-being can be a framework that Bhutan can offer, or the GNH can offer. And the other is, I think, this idea of planetary boundaries. I know Diana mentioned a little bit about, how we are being sold this idea of limited resources. And in one way, I think the natural resources are in some ways limited. I mean, some of it can be regenerative, but we have to be also very conscious of how we can make that regenerative, right? Like whether what we extract has to be also put back in a way that that is not unsustainable. So I think the idea of planetary boundaries as well as societal well-being are two basic concepts that GNH can offer and can be applied to all over the world. In terms of specifically how we measure the progress, as I had mentioned in my opening, I think there are different domains that can be important. For Bhutan, we have some, I would say, some very what's the word I'm looking for? Non-tangible sort of aspects of well-being, which is like, for example, community vitality. What does that even mean? How is that tangible? So I think there are some tangible as well as non-tangible aspects of progress and well-being that people can think about, and that can be context specific to each cultures and communities. What is important? I think for Bhutan, for example, preservation of our culture is very important. They have also said that good governance is important. So, there are these aspects of other aspects of progress and well-being that we think are important, and we include that in the measurement matrices. So I think all over the world, there can be these kinds of ideas that can be applied in a local context. But more importantly, when we think about managing our natural resources, I think, again, like at a practical level, something cost accounting, which is also sometimes called environmental cost accounting. So I think accounting for some of the natural resources, some of the social resources or human resources, cultural resources, accounting for all of that makes sense. And again, to make that even more practical, I think globally right now there are movements such as, including life cycle thinking, including sort of the over the value chain, knowing where your things come from, making full disclosures of what goes into food, for example, or where what kind of energy is used, or what kind of things went into bringing something from, I don't know, US to Bhutan, for example. Having, I think, awareness of all of that, so accounting for all of that makes it a little bit easier for us to simplify some of the complexity of how to go move away from GDP to a more GNH world. So I hope that answers some of your questions. I'll be happy to answer more.
Thank you for the insights, Pam. There's a lot for us to think about, and hopefully think about it together. And with this, I will be going to the question and answers. We have come to an end to the panel discussion, and we've had very interesting insights, how we think about well-being differently and how nature can play a role in fostering well-being beyond consumption-based growth. So I will open the floor for question and answers. We've actually received quite a few questions. So there were quite a few, and we don't have that much time. So we've combined the questions to give a general question to the panel. And it would be nice if each of you could answer it in 1 or 2 minutes. I know that's difficult, but that would be nice. So the question that we got, which we've combined, is how do we get global corporations who thrive from taxes to collaborate for localization? What's the immediate win for them? And yeah, this would be the general question. And maybe we can start with Pam, then Diana, and then Helena.
How do we get, what was the question again?
Yeah, how do we get global corporations who thrive from taxes to collaborate for localization? What's the immediate win for them?
So I think in terms of global collaboration, at first, I think we have to begin with having one, our nose is pointing in one direction. And I think sometimes that is maybe the toughest way forward to come to one idea of what development means to us. I think globally things are changing, and we are starting to move or understand maybe the impacts of our development activities into our lifestyles and our individual sort of what effects that we are facing because of what we thought was development. In terms of cooperation, I think, especially in context of Bhutan, I think for us, we really need the world to understand and adopt this GNH idea. And that is, I would say, the beginning of changing a lot of things. I think there are many technicalities when you come to, how does that work in terms of global finance, for example, or global taxation policies, etc. But I think that the main beginning is to maybe understand that this is important, because I think this doesn't really happen easily, even though we all agree to it. In practice, I think our currency, Bhutan's currency, is quite limited in achieving, I think, the kind of transformation that we are seeking.
Thank you. Now, maybe Diana.
Yeah, I can't think of any win for global corporations that they could get out of more local communities. But I think we have to acknowledge the power that citizens have to insist on what they want and what well-being is for them, and how, yeah, as I said before, in Camarones, we can achieve that by creating other projects that are more better for the community, and then try to do some social pressure on the government to say that is what we want and not the other thing. And yeah, I think that is the most important thing. And I think to just illustrate how much social pressure works is, we are now in Argentina very proud of being the first country that that passed the bill to forbid salmon farming in Tierra del Fuego. And I think that was something that no one could imagine that could ever happen, and it did. So I think it is very important for us citizens to get involved and just fight for what we want, and not fight in a bad way, not fight in a violent way, but just insisting on that we want something that is good for us, and we have the right to do that, because that is what we're here for, to live well and to be healthy and to enjoy being part of nature and not being under some big corporations that work for their own profit.
Thank you, Diana. Now to Helena.
Yeah, I think actually for the individuals who work inside these global corporations, there's a definite win. When you study the global economy, what you understand is that it has set in motion a competitive rat race, which is getting faster and faster. And it has been based on continuing to subsidize energy and technology to replace people. So it is a job-destroying, rapid, competitive race to find the cheapest resources to replace people with energy and technology. That's what's happening with this modern technological system. And the whole enterprise now is to rush off to Mars to try to look for more scarce minerals. It's a madness. It means that when you were the CEO of Exxon, you had to run in fear, because when there was a merger with Mobil, who was going to be the CEO? The head of Mobil or you? So you have a system where people are chasing their own tail. Unfortunately, I think Diana is right that as a corporate structure, it's going to be very difficult to persuade them to do things differently. But as individuals in those corporations, I think if we can get a holistic, clear understanding of what's going on out, this could make all the difference. I see that no government, no World Bank, no institution of any kind that I know, except for small alternative think tanks, have actually studied this system and understood what's going on. So it's essentially being driven by blindness, by fear and blindness. I do agree so much with Diana that part of what we have to be telling ourselves is literally 99% of the global population is not benefiting from this change. And as I'm saying, even the individuals inside the corporations aren't either. But the rest that are outside of those giant structures have every right to come together and demand of their governments to pursue different policies. What I'm longing for is that Bhutan will continue with its leadership. It's playing an incredibly important role in the world, and it's become a sort of touchstone for people who really want to encourage another way. My dream is that Bhutan will reach out to other countries and that we'll have a group of countries that together lead the way. Bhutan on its own is very difficult, any single country on its own, except for the United States. But other than that, perhaps a linking up with a Scandinavian country, maybe with New Zealand, to create a collaborative breakaway strategy where these countries together say, sorry, big business, global corporation, we are now going to be looking out for the needs of our environment and our people, and we're going to be shifting our policies to represent that. So that kind of breakaway strategy, there are little signs that it may happen, and I think that that would be the way forward when a group of countries together start taking this on and have the support of their citizens and have really the support of the majority of citizens on this planet. It would be so applauded from the entire, global population, really. So I do see hopeful signs, and I think we should all do what we can to maintain this holistic perspective and get it out there.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you to all our panelists for the time that you've taken out with us. Now, I have a question for Mr. Sabir Hussain Chaudhry, and as we are running out of time, maybe you can answer it and then we can proceed to the concluding remarks. So the question that we received is, with the increasing use of inland waterways, what needs to be done to ensure that the fragile ecosystem is not abused?
Marine transportation is actually the cheapest mode of transport if you compare it to road and rail and air. But I think now we are finally coming to terms globally with aviation as well as shipping. And I think this is, we are trying to regulate. So I think here it is going to be enforcing standards and regulating them very, very closely. We have a very, should I say, a very vibrant debate at the moment in Bangladesh. There is a coal power plant in Rampal that is being built. And it's a coal-based power plant, and the coal is going to come through the river channels. And we are talking about, well, what happens if a boat meets with an accident, and what is that going to do to the rivers, the pollution, and the biodiversity? So where possible, avoid it. But I don't think it's something that you can avoid, especially in a riverine country like Bangladesh, which is crisscrossed by rivers. We can't stop that. So I think there we must have higher standards, and we must have a very strict enforcement and regulation. There is no alternative to that. We make laws quite often, and we have got lots of laws, but I think where we fail is that the enforcement part is missing. So yes, water I think is there, but now you also have, you have solar energy, which is coming up in a big way, which is driving engines and other things. So I think these are things that we can actually do. And as you know, now in shipping also in Bangladesh, we are enforcing it. The marine oil that we use has to have very low content of sulfur, which is the one that actually pollutes. So I think there is progress, but it should be a lot more. And it will be good to have shipping and aviation in particular come within the emission regime that we want to see created.
Okay, and would that also be your concluding remarks? Then we can wrap this up.
Okay, I think I really enjoyed the conversation, and everyone. I think Helena, also Pam, and also Diana. I think you have all contributed from your own areas of expertise, and I think the fundamental point is there is no one size that fits all. But I think what this dialogue does is gives us a chance to revisit this whole discourse and discussion. No one is going to claim or pretend that the system is working. If the system was working, we didn't need the Millennium Development Goals, and now we don't need the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals wouldn't have this very aspirational statement, leaving no one behind. The current system does leave people behind. The current system does create inequalities, whether it be in income, in terms of wealth, in terms of opportunities, in terms of gender, in terms of race. So the system hasn't really performed well, and there are so many drawbacks. So what we are really talking about today, and I will just summarize the main points in a bit, is we are trying to formulate a new narrative as to how we want to live. If you break it all down, that's what we are really talking about. How do we want to live? And so I think when you're talking about a new narrative, we can come up with statistics, we can come up with examples, but it's always a story that moves people the most. And I think that's our target. It's not just the policymakers, it's people. How do we create that level of consciousness in them? And stories are powerful because they are understood and they're remembered. So we have to come up with a better story. And through the intervention of the three panelists today, I think we have seen there are so many good examples of what is happening around the world. So we can make that a very powerful and a very persuasive story. So really that new model has to transition very quickly, because we can't have a time lag of 30, 40 years to transition to that new model. The big question is, can we transition within the existing model, or do we have to come up with a new model that allows us to transition better? I think that's really the big challenge, because the existing model puts confines and shackles on you. So can you break free of that? and come up with something? Do you first have to create a vacuum and then push in the new model? Or is there an orderly and a disciplined transition? I think that's a very interesting question that we can't go into today. But to summarize the very rich discussions that we have, and I'll just refer to the notes that I have here. Firstly, I think learning from the Bhutan experience, I think that's very important. And what Pam talked about, we have to make a conscious choice. So we have to make a call first. We have to make a decision to develop the tools that we need for screening policies. I think that is very, very important. And we need to have a holistic system of drivers for well-being. So well-being, of course, is a very broad-based concept, but ecological well-being, I think, is very important there. So that's the first point. And the second point is we need to reinstate the current knowledge that we have. And we also need to blend and merge that with new knowledge that is coming up. So, how do we research in terms of going back to nature? Because that's our home. That's where we came from. We moved away, and now we are trying to move back. How can the new and the old local work? How can we learn from those? And how can we learn from each other, not just to survive, but also to thrive? I think that's very important. It's not just mere survival. It's actually thriving. It's prospering. So it's just beyond survival. The relationship with nature, how that is shifting, how that is changing, how that is evolving. I think it is important for us to understand that, and to think of the species and the ecosystem and the biodiversity as part of our culture. It's an extension of our own being. And as I said, that we are embedded in it. So when we talk about cultural well-being, we can't look at ourselves in isolation from all of those aspects. We also had the issue of rewilding that I think Diana talked about, the participatory rewilding for new development thinking, and working with communities, which is the most important part of all, because we are talking about livelihoods. So what are their concerns? What are their fears? What are their worries? How can we foster community groups? How can we create the transitions? How can we enhance, empower them? How can we build better livelihoods? I think this is all very important. How can we make them independent in terms of their food and the well-being, the access to health and education? I think that is also something that came up very powerfully. The next point is, as I mentioned, diverse solutions. There are different contexts, there are different origins. Like, for instance, in Bhutan, we heard you have this very strong culture and legacy already there, that 60% of forests have to be, or 60% of the land area has to be forest. So you are working from a much more established base. So I think we have to respect that diversity and take that into account. I talked about the importance of measuring, because what you don't measure, you can't value. So what it is that we actually want to measure, I think that's very important. That's also a point that has come through. So it's social well-being. It's respect for planetary boundaries. I talked about planetary overshoot. If you look at the world today, and I know this figure from the planetary emergency motion that I had in the Bangladesh Parliament, what we are supposed to consume over a 12-month period, we are actually consuming over a 7-month period. So, and this number is actually shortening. So we will need 2 planet Earths to meet our requirements as we have them today. So I think respect for planetary boundaries is going to be very important. And of course, the last point that came in is, the current system is on the premise that you create a scarcity. So how do you then move from the economics of scarcity to one of abundance, which then allows us to reconnect with nature and go back to nature? I think those were some of the important points that came through. I'm sure there'll be others that you might have picked up on, but from my part, it's been an absolute pleasure and a delight, and really privilege to be able to make that summary. I hope I've been able to do justice to the interventions and the contributions, and I have certainly learned a lot. So thank you to all of the panelists, from myself, and to you, Benita, for moderating it so well.
And thank you for everyone for joining us. And we hope to welcome you again in December for the Eastern Himalayan Forum on Ecology is Economy. And thank you again for joining us. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Bye now.